I can afford to take these things lightly, protected as I am by citizenship of a liberal nation where freedom of expression is a fundamental right. My critics are at liberty to claim that I'm trying to convert children to Satanism, and I'm free to explain that I'm exploring human nature and morality, or to say you're an idiot, depending on which side of the bed I got out of that day.
J.K. Rowling is one of the most successful children's authors of all time. Her most recognised and successful work, the Harry Potter series, has become a global phenomenon, leading to a series of movie adaptations, video games, spin-off books, a stage play, and countless other tie-in pieces of merchandise, theme parks, and experiences. Rowling's story is both inspiring and magical. Once a struggling single mother just trying to get by, she was catapulted into celebrity and became a beloved public figure, forever to be remembered as a kind, caring, and thoughtful woman. And both her story and her work an inspiration to millions of people the world over. All was well. So anyway, let's talk about Psycho. There's no denying that Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 horror Psycho is influential. As a film, it casts a long shadow not just over the horror genre, but over Hollywood cinema in general. From its iconic shower scene, parodied and referenced so much that it's become a recognisable trope beyond the film in which it originated, to Bernard Herrmann's instantly recognisable score, the screeching of the violin setting the tone for countless imitators ever since, Psycho truly is one of the most important films ever made. I first encountered it at an incredibly impressionable young age, and it blew my fucking mind. I didn't have any context for Psycho beyond the film itself. I suspect I'd probably seen one or two parodies of iconic scenes, but even then I wouldn't have put two and two together. And that's actually really important, I think, because not knowing what Psycho's about changes the way that you view it. I definitely know that it was my introduction to Hitchcock though, and for a budding film fan that was massive. I mean, it wasn't scary. I've never found Psycho particularly scary, but there are twists and turns in the narrative that without prior knowledge change the way that you view the movie, and it changed the way that I looked at film altogether. We'll get into all of this a little bit deeper later, but for now just understand that I loved Psycho as a kid. But while it's easy to discuss the overwhelmingly positive impact the film had on me, on American cinema, and on the horror genre in particular, it's less so to delve into its more problematic elements, and Psycho can be a bit of a problem, so why do I love it so much?
Mr. Hitchcock, what is your definition of happiness?
Who is Alfred Hitchcock? I'm sure most people probably already know this, but we'll go over it again briefly just to be sure. Hitchcock is often regarded as one of the all-time great filmmakers, pioneering techniques and ideas that are still used today. He began his career in the UK during the silent era, but by 1939 he'd earned himself international recognition and moved to Hollywood, where he proceeded to produce a series of films that are still pretty highly regarded today. These include the likes of 1951's Strangers on a Train, 1954's Rear Window, 1963's The Birds, and 1948's Rope, a film that takes place in real time but is shot and edited to appear to be 4 single long takes. It's also one of the greatest movies ever made, in my opinion. Obviously. Hitchcock's focus on tense, nail-biting plots and sequences earned him the moniker the Master of Suspense, and he employed and innovated a series of techniques, themes and tropes that gave his films a specific style, Hitchcockian, if you will. As Richard Allen points out in his essay, Hitchcock's films employ the idioms of classical suspense informed by conventional morality, yet they take ludic pleasure in prolonging and stylizing suspense in ways that subvert the customary alliance between emotional identification and moral allegiance. His firm grip on the craft of filmmaking meant that not only was he able to create timeless, successful and classic films again and again, but also that he did so while essentially laying out the groundwork for his own cinematic language, innovating and designing concepts and devices that would go on to be employed by other filmmakers throughout history. Alongside Rope's incredible long takes, perhaps the best known example of this comes in the form of the iconic vertigo zoom, or dolly zoom. an in-camera technique that good old Hitch employed in his 1958 thriller Vertigo. The director had actually tried to create the sequence for 1940's Rebecca, but it hadn't worked the way that Hitch wanted, so he returned to it again for Vertigo. Reportedly, it was cameraman Erman Roberts who figured out how to get the results the master of suspense wanted. And since then, it's cropped up all over the place. We see it utilised in a scene in Steven Spielberg's 1975 blockbuster Jaws. It appears in Martin Scorsese's 1990 crime drama Goodfellas. Peter Jackson used it in 2001's The Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring, and even animation jumped in on the action, with the effect cropping up in 1999's Toy Story 2, and, perhaps more famously, 1994's The Lion King. Of course, they managed to fuck that up in the remake too. Fucking Favreau. Whether it's Steven Spielberg and his use of suspense to build tension, Christopher Nolan and his focus on spectacle-driven storytelling, or even Quentin Tarantino in his slow-build, knuckle-whitening dialogue sequences, the master of suspense's presence can be felt throughout modern cinema. Psycho, meanwhile, remains arguably his most recognisable and influential film. The ever-twisting and turning nature of the narrative not only toys with the audience's expectations of what a then-contemporary thriller horror should be, but it also exists in conversation with Hitchcock's own prior cinematic output, directly commenting on and then subverting the very tropes and ideas that he himself helped define in the first place. All of this earned him the reputation as an auteur, a term used to describe an artist, usually a filmmaker, who is seen as the single authorial voice of a work. Hitchcock as an auteur is a well-worn topic. As film scholar Paige A. Driscoll writes, the visual techniques that Hitchcock employed are what made him the internationally recognised auteur that he is credited as today. And his films do share many common recurring elements. The Man, Woman on the Run appears in everything from 1935's The 39 Steps, 1942's Saboteur, and perhaps most famously, 1959's North by Northwest, which also features the use of another Hitchcockian trope, the MacGuffin, an object that propels the plot but ultimately matters very little to it. Hitchcock's films have also been noted for being, at least in relation to the time, rather sexualised, and the director pushed boundaries here too. There's the taboo sexual tension of 1943's Shadow of a Doubt, and then there's North by Northwest again, which features one of my fave ever visual innuendos. Well, unless we count this one, because it's a hooker, see? Kids' movies are fun. The point is, it's easy to apply the concept of a single authorial voice to the man and his work. Hitchcock is arguably the first auteur. He was, after all, a personality. He had his own television show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, an anthology show of typically Hitchcockian stories that he would, present. He often featured in the advertisements for his movies, both in text and in the imagery. And then, of course, there were his cameos. His many cameos. Oh my god, he's just ripping off Stan Lee.
Enough said.
Hitchcock was kind of the draw. People came to see his films, his style, and while he did work with major stars, there was an expectation when you went to go and see a Hitchcock film that you were going to get something, well, Hitchcockian. In their review for North by Northwest, The New Yorker called it a perfect parody of his own work, while Variety said it was the Alfred Hitchcock mixture, suspense, intrigue, comedy humour, seldom has the concoction been served up so delectably. You see, the audiences, they enjoyed that. They saw Hitchcock's name on the poster and they knew what they were in for. But Hitch didn't like that. Psycho sits proudly within Hitchcock's filmography as a film that utilises these recurring elements to deliberately place the audience in a false sense of security before pulling the rug out from under them and revealing its true hand. Psycho, you see, is all about subversion. Subversion of Americana, subversion of thriller tropes, subversion of gender norms, and subversion of Hitchcock himself. In fact, if we're to believe 2012's Hitchcock, a biopic based on Stephen Rebello's 1990s non-fiction book, Hitch was drawn to Psycho precisely because he saw it as an opportunity to shock his audience once more. And I do believe that movie, because movies are facts, even when they're documentaries about how the earth is flat. Assuming this was, of course, Hitchcock's intention, then I think it's fair to say that he succeeded. As film critic Robin Wood wrote, Psycho works by taking the familiar and the everyday as its starting point. The film plunges deeper and deeper into the abnormal. Everything in Psycho seems to hint towards the dark and seedy underbelly of an otherwise perfect American society. The Bates house looms over the stereotypically unimposing motel. Like a monstrous spectre in the sky, the hint of Gothic to come. The film's protagonist, Marion, seeks the idyllic heteronormative relationship, but she must resort to criminal behaviour in order to achieve it. How? Even the film's dark and twisted underbelly has its own rotting core, with the Miss Havisham-style sinister old lady locked away in the house turning out to be, well, a fucking corpse. It's like the opening of David Lynch's Blue Velvet, where the camera just zooms in on the grass to reveal all the bugs underneath. Except if those bugs had bugs on them, and then those bugs were men dressed like ladies. Psycho opens with Marion Crane, played by the iconic Janet Leigh, who, wanting to write off her boyfriend's debt so that they could get married, every girl's dream, steals money from her boss and skips town. While it's easy now to find yourself waiting for the killer, it's important to note that part of Psycho's success is the fact that it's not actually a horror film. Well, at least not at first. The opening half of the movie follows a fairly typical Hitchcockian structure. Marion takes the money. She leaves town and heads off to meet her boyfriend. She encounters a really obnoxious and irritating police officer. So, just a police officer. And then trades in her car in order to avoid detection. Then she travels to the isolated Bates Motel merely as a place to stop off for the evening. She meets the proprietor of the motel, Anthony Perkins' awkward but likeable Norman Bates. And it's important to note here as well that Perkins at the time was best known for his roles as a love interest. Norman seems okay, but as we learn, his elderly mother lives with him in the creepy old house that sits atop the hill. After having dinner with Bates, Marion retires to her room, and here she decides to return the money and face the consequences of her actions. But then things take a now rather infamous turn. This happens more or less at the movie's midpoint, and our heroine, who is also one of the most recognisable names in the movie, is suddenly, unceremoniously, and rather brutally killed off. Wait, what? What is this film about? Then we watch as Norman frantically disposes of the body in a local swamp. Does anything we've just watched for the last 40 minutes or so even matter anymore? And so audiences, and I include myself in this upon first watch, were understandably a little bit confused about how the rest of the movie was going to play out. I mean, where the hell is all of this going? Of course, everybody knows the shower scene now, so this facet of the narrative really doesn't have the impact. I mean, it's wildly iconic, but it's important to remember how abrupt and unexpected the nature of this scene actually is. We're left with a character we've only just met, disposing of our lead's body, and then we're introduced to a bunch of new characters. Movies didn't do this, they just didn't. And they certainly didn't do it in such a violent and brutal way, and make no mistake, the shower scene is really fucking brutal. It might not seem like much now, but honestly I think that's more to do with just how overplayed it is because, well, look at it. This comes out of nowhere. Up until this point, the closest thing we've had to any kind of violence, other than the film's title, are the striking lines in the opening credits. This is bonkers. The entire movie just suddenly and unexpectedly shifts gears, first offing its lead character, and then throwing out the rest of the established narrative as well. Quite literally drowning it all in a swamp. The money, the incident with the police officer, the whole on the run element, absolutely none of it appears to matter anymore. We've gone from well-worn typical Hitchcockian hijinks to the birth of the entire slasher subgenre in the space of around a minute. And I don't think people talk about this enough. Hitchcock essentially throws his own rulebook in the bin, and in doing so turns the entirety of horror cinema on its head. And let's not forget that that rulebook was already some of the key groundwork for all of cinema to come anyway. The image of Janet Leigh soaping herself up under the warm stream of water, blissfully unaware of the sinister and unknown shadowy figure lurking behind the curtain, is perhaps one of the single most impactful moments ever committed to film. And no, that's not hyperbole. Without it, there's no Michael Myers, no Jason Voorhees, no Freddy Krueger. And without those guys, there's no Chucky, and I love Chucky, so that's just unacceptable. As Sven Mikulik wrote in his article, Psycho is considered by many to be the first slasher movie, and the success of this film spurred a whole series of slasher films in the near future, ultimately opening the door for the subgenre's golden era, the extremely bloody 80s. And we haven't even got to the bit where Psycho's partly responsible for the way we even watch movies today. Hitchcock famously employed a marketing campaign that saw the studio sending out requirements on how to screen the film. These requirements included the no one will be admitted once the picture starts rule. Something that might seem fairly normal now, but at the time was pretty unusual because people would just go see a movie whenever the hell they wanted, and it didn't matter if they'd missed the beginning because they'd just stay until the next showing. The marketing campaign also saw the studio send out posters that read, "Don't give away the ending, it's the only one we have." Psycho's just awesome, and we should all celebrate it. But while its incredible influence on cinema has had many positive outcomes, it is also the start of a rather insidious and troubling trend. And no, I'm not talking about the fact that we can now flush toilets in movies. Thanks, Hitch! Rather, I'm talking about the negative portrayal of transcoded characters in Hollywood cinema, and the negative impact that portrayal has had on audiences in general. As tired and cliched as it may have become, the trans as killer trope most certainly plays a part in how society views trans people. After all, media can be a very powerful tool. And J.K. Rowling knows that.
Brian De Palma, the master of the macabre, invites you to a showing of the latest fashion in murder. Dressed to kill.
Let's talk about transphobia, or more specifically, let's talk about the way that mainstream Hollywood handles transcoded characters. Post-Psycho, there was a flux of rip-offs, knock-offs, pseudo-remakes, one actual terrible remake, and various thematic extensions and movies covering similar topics. And all of them are a fucking problem. Well, okay, that's not strictly fair to say, but I think what is fair to say is that Hollywood has a rather nasty habit of coding its trans characters as other. In fact, I suspect that it's fair to say that for the general public, most of what they knew about transgender people came from these types of movies. Probably The Silence of the Lambs.
It won't do.
Thankfully, representation has improved in recent years. Trans people do appear in more movies and TV shows these days. Things are getting better. And because of that, everything is perfect now. Okay, so it'd be silly to pretend like all of this has gone away just because the community's become more vocal in recent years. After all, trans people do still face an uphill struggle, filled with misinformation, prejudice and transphobia. And a big part of that does come from the way we're represented in the movies. And a lot of that starts with Psycho. For those of you who don't already know, in Psycho it turns out that actually it's not Mother who was the killer. It was Norman all along. That's right folks, Norman's been dressing up as Mother. In fact, he thinks he is Mother. They inhabit the same body. Essentially, he has a kind of multiple personality disorder. Well, he has a very 1960s offensive version of multiple personality disorder, but we'll come back to all of that in a little bit. For Norman, this manifests first by keeping his mother's corpse hanging around the house, carrying out conversations with her, and generally just being an all-round great son. And dressing up in her clothes, donning a wig and murdering any young woman who happens to get him aroused. And the smart ones of you in the audience are now going, well, hold on a minute, that's not what being transgender is, and you're right. The thing is, that doesn't matter, not when it comes to the movies. Movies are a fundamentally visual medium. It's the visuals that matter, and the visuals of Psycho are this. While Norman Bates isn't actually a transgender character, such is the way that Hollywood presents complex issues like gender, and the way audiences inevitably receive them, that basically anyone who is presented as having some kind of gender issue is automatically coded trans for simplicity. In the world of movies, there's no real difference between someone like Norman Bates and someone like Lily Alb in The Danish Girl. So while Norman Bates isn't strictly a transgender character, that sort of doesn't really matter. Beyond the fact that social acceptance and understanding of such subjects has moved forward, slightly, both are still demonstrably presented as the other, despite the disparate levels of sympathy the filmmakers present their subjects with. In The Danish Girl, Alb's story is still an other story. It's just not framed through horror, and this is true of basically every trans character. Psycho may very well be the obvious trendsetter in this respect, but we have seen the trope take shape in everything from prestigious Oscar-winning classics like Jonathan Demme's 1991 psychological thriller The Silence of the Lambs, to schlocky popcorn trash like 1983's Sleepaway Camp, which is a thing.
How can it be? Oh my God, she's a boy.
Don't worry, I definitely intend to make a video about Sleepaway Camp at some point. The first of the Psycho knockoffs was probably William Castle's 1961 horror Homicidal. Castle was the king of schlocky B-movie horrors, and he often employed the use of gimmicks to sell his movies to audiences. His 1959 flick House on Haunted Hill saw him rig a skeleton prop to the ceiling of the theatre, and it would float over audiences at key points in the movie. Because skeletons are scary? For Homicidal, Castle introduced the fright break. A timer would appear on the screen at a point in the film's climax, and audiences had 45 seconds to get a refund if they were too frightened to carry on watching. I don't know about Fright Break, but the Marvel movies would definitely benefit from something like this. Godfather and Apocalypse Now director Francis Ford Coppola got his start with a Psycho knockoff, 1963's Dementia 13. And there were others too. Hammer Studios produced a slew of their own mini Hitchcocks, beginning with 1961's Scream of Fear. And in 1965 we got Fanatic, or for those Misfits fans among you, Die Die My Darling. But a lot of these films employed the structure of Psycho rather than focusing on the twist. The gender bending element would only really start rearing its ugly head as time wore on. Perhaps the most obvious through line between these films and Psycho comes in the form of Carrie, Scarface and The Untouchables director Brian De Palma. De Palma is a director whose work has often been compared to Hitchcock, who has confessed himself that "I've always felt I've taken the ideas of Hitchcock and tried to develop them further." And Brian De Palma is awesome. His movies are problematic as fuck, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I don't enjoy his particular brand of schlocky schlock. That would make me a liar. I mean, he's basically just making the films Hitchcock probably would have had he been around to make them. And I like Alfred Hitchcock, so De Palma's work is flashy, cool and stylish. The focus is almost always on technical aspects over everything else. He uses cool techniques like weird camera angles and unusual tracking shots and things. In fact, one of his fave things to do is called the split diopter shot. A shot that's designed to create an effect where both the foreground and background are in focus, and De Palma uses it all the time. He uses it when it's people overhearing something, he uses it when it's people seeing something, and he even uses it when it's people sat at a restaurant talking about something and they're putting everyone around them off their food. And that's really funny because what they're talking about is transgender people. Fucking De Palma. The simple fact is that as far as Hollywood is concerned, and especially as far as horror movies are concerned, gender basically falls into three categories. Obviously there are examples that don't fit with this, but by and large this is how I see it. 1. Overcoming gender, in which a character faces certain issues or problems because of their gender. Most often these issues come in the form of societal expectations or perceived weaknesses that the characters must then overcome or disprove. Perhaps the most obvious example of this I can think of would be 1998's Mulan, in which a young woman lies about her gender so that she can take her father's place in the military during an invasion. But this is probably the most common of all the gender-centric subgenres, and we see it time and time again. Essentially it's a play on heteronormative ideology. The belief that there are two separate and opposing genders with associated natural roles that match their assigned sex. And it includes movies from as broad and varied a style as 2000's Erin Brockovich, 2016's Hidden Figures, and a personal favourite of mine, 2000's Miss Congeniality. Yes, I like Miss Congeniality. Who cares if its only fans are me and Chandler Bing?
She's an FBI agent posing as a beauty contestant.
Yay Chandler, we can definitely be friends. There's no transphobia there. Shit. 2. Gender swap, in which a character, usually male, must present as the opposite sex. This is normally due to some sort of undercover assignment or supernatural occurrence, and it almost always results in hilarious hijinks. These predominantly take the form of comedies, and often sees their protagonists face off against a society that views their attitudes or behaviours as problematic for not fitting with their presumed gender, but ultimately proving society wrong by overcoming the prejudice based on that presumed gender. It may not come as a surprise to you to learn that this particular subgenre is one that I have a especially difficult and complex relationship with. Nonetheless, you know these movies well. 1993's Miss Doubtfire, 1982's Tootsie, and of course 2004's White Chicks.
What's up, money? You got a problem? What you looking at my ass for? Nah, yo, hold my poodle. Hold my poodle.
I don't get it either. 3. Nightmarish gender. And this one, unsurprisingly, lives most comfortably within a horror genre. This is where gender is presented as something we should fear. Clive Barker's 1987 horror Hellraiser plays with heteronormative gender ideology. Ridley Scott's 1979 masterpiece Alien takes a nightmarish look at childbirth. And Brian De Palma crops up again here too with his 1976 Stephen King adaptation Carrie. Maybe De Palma has a bit of a problem with gender. It's here that the problematic representation of trans people exists. In Hollywood's desire to simplistically express ideas to audiences, and the visualization of this concept thanks to the requirements of the medium, we get gender as a monster. A confused and overly simplified take on complicated and difficult issues. Of course, an argument could be made that the whole point of art is to explore these issues, but because of the way it's done, and because of the way Hollywood tends to use these tropes not to explore, but to simply shock and surprise its audience, ultimately this does more harm than it does good in terms of representation. So although Norman Bates is not a trans character, the language of cinema is such that it doesn't really make the distinction. Norman Bates isn't trans, and yet he is trans, and therefore he's coded simplistically as other. Such is the language of cinema that anyone deviating from the heteronormative standard essentially becomes an easy shorthand for filmmakers to explain away the things their villains do. And of course, this is a problem. As Dr. Tina Kubrick notes in her essay, movies can change audiences' attitudes towards certain groups of people and cause newly formed opinions on various issues. Whether we care to admit it or not, cinema, and especially mainstream Hollywood cinema, shapes and informs societal views and mindsets. The killer transgender character is an unfair and dangerous stereotype that harms trans people for simply existing, and encourages the less tolerant and more ignorant members of society to continue in their intolerance and ignorance. Now that's not to say that Psycho itself is inherently hateful or bigoted as a text. And indeed the film goes to great efforts to separate its troubled killer from the trans community. To quote John Phillips, the narrative is at pains to dissociate itself from the negative representation of transgender, even going so far as to insert a rather cumbersome and exposition-heavy sequence at the end of the movie in which a police psychiatrist explains that Bates is not a transvestite because he does not dress in women's clothes to achieve an erotic thrill. He was simply doing everything possible to keep alive the illusion of his mother being alive. He tried to be his mother. But while the film does do this and its efforts kind of appreciated, I think it's hard to deny that the film doesn't use the revelation of Mother's true identity for shocks. I mean... In this moment, Hitchcock is toying with the uncanny. As Norman screams, the wig falls off and the intent of the film becomes all the more clear. Norman is psychotic, and part of that is that he presents himself and believes himself to be a woman. Social norms of the time were such that a man presenting as a woman, or indeed revealing any aspect of their femininity, was an unusual sight. It was even played for laughs to incredibly successful effect a year earlier in Billy Wilder's classic comedy Some Like It Hot.
But you don't understand, Osgood. I'm a man. Well, nobody's perfect.
And one brandishing a weapon and looming over his victim was probably terrifying and unsettling in equal measure. The fact that Norman isn't presented as female in this moment but rather as a man in a dress is also important to note. There were 3 actresses who played Mother throughout the rest of the film: Mitzi Kostner, Ann Dorr and Margot Epper. And I think the fact that Hitchcock cast women in these roles says a lot. When we get the reveal, it's undeniably Perkins. And there's something to be said here about the idea that trans people are somehow hiding or tricking people when they transition. Since Mother's face is always hidden before the reveal anyway, Perkins could have just as easily played the role. But Hitchcock wants to trick the audience, and we all understand that. It's a twist, it's a reveal. The twist is that it's Norman, a man, and Mother is just a costume. And there's an element of anti-trans ideology here. As J.K. Rowling herself put it, woman is not a costume. It's the notion that trans women are actually predatory men disguising themselves in order to gain access to women-only spaces. But here's the thing. Isn't everything a costume? Dr. Harper Benjamin Keenan says, what are all the different ways to dress our bodies? When and how do we choose a costume? Is all clothing a costume? The point is, Hitchcock uses this moment to shock. Even though Mother is female, presented as female and portrayed by females, Norman is still coded as male, and thus coded as a male killer. And this is part of the problem. Transness as depicted on screen doesn't bother to explore these kinds of questions. It works almost exclusively within heteronormative binary gender roles. Transness as depicted on screen is, more often than not, psychotic men dressed as ladies. Norman isn't Mother. As Hannibal Lecter would put it, he just thinks he is. And that's the key. The film essentially invites and then encourages audiences to make the conflation it will not 5 minutes later attempt to distance itself from. And De Palma's take on all of this is all the more exploitative and sleazy. Dress to Kill's a fucking mess. I love it, but I can't rightly sit here and defend it because it's gross and problematic and disgusting. The best I can say about it is that, hey, it looks really cool. The film is essentially just a remake of Psycho. It follows a similar narrative structure, it follows a similar setup, and it features a similar twist and reveal. But in typically De Palma-esque style, all of these things are taken and then expanded upon in a more sleazy, exploitative and grisly fashion. Unlike Psycho, Dress to Kill forgoes any pretense that the killer is not trans, and instead outright states that its own murderous villain is a woman trapped inside a man's body, and the film literally goes with that. Moreover, in De Palma's world, not only is the killer trans, but they're definitively and unquestionably a killer because they're trans. Unlike in Hitchcock's movie, there's no attempt by the film to distance itself from this problematic representation, and instead Dress to Kill leans heavily into this particular aspect as both a motive and an explanation. The confusion and conflict of gender within the character is definitively used as a reason for why they've become psychotic, and it's one the film seems to take as perfectly logical and self-explanatory. As far as Dress to Kill is concerned, the killer is trans, and therefore, of course they're a killer. It's a worrisome reading that has no doubt impacted on general audiences perhaps more than they realise. Psycho, in many respects, aims to separate its villain from their coded transness. Sounds weird to say, but it does. It's almost as if the movie recognises that there might be a problematic element here and then attempts to address it. It fails, but it does try. But Dress to Kill opts instead to lean directly into this, essentially making transness the motive for the violence. And it does this even though it also features a clumsy and exposition-heavy psychiatrist sequence. Weirdly, it's as if De Palma then realises that he forgot to have the psychiatrist make the distinction, because he then includes a second exposition dump. But as we saw earlier, this just results in a joke about how trans people are gross and therefore inappropriate dinner conversation. What the fuck, Brian? To quote John Phillips once more, in these films the narrative is driven centrally by the quest for knowledge of the killer's identity, and the denouement is dominated by the dramatic and surprising revelation of this identity. The process involves two simultaneous unveilings, that of the murderer's identity and that of their gender. Basically, because all of these films are riffing on Psycho, and because Psycho's so iconic that it brings with it its own expectations, the gender revelation, and then the conflation of that with the killer, is kind of baked into the DNA. Nobody remembers the bit with the boring and intrusive exposition doctor, they just remember Norman Bates in a dress. And why wouldn't you? He's so damn sexy. So what about Silence of the Lambs then? That doesn't feature this big revelation or twist. We always know Buffalo Bill is male, and we also know from fairly early on that they're coded trans. In fact, the Silence of the Lambs has a whole other problem, when it tries to make the case that Buffalo Bill isn't trans. But it does this in a really weird and confusing way. Firstly, the dialogue is directly at odds with the imagery on film. Secondly, it feels very shoehorned in an attempt to counter this particular reading. And thirdly, it doesn't even make any sense.
Billy is not a real transsexual, but he thinks he is. He tries to be.
What are you talking about, Hannibal? But even if the dialogue did make sense, it's still completely at odds with how the film presents Buffalo Bill as a character. I mean, they're building a woman's suit. Many gender-critical feminists like to make sweeping claims about trans folk that position trans women as violent male subjects infiltrating women's spaces and appropriating women's bodies. And if abducting, killing and skinning young women in order to make a woman's suit isn't appropriating female bodies, then I don't know what is. So even though the film has its nonsensical attempt to distance itself from real-world transgender people, it's still a movie that presents its villain as falling in line with nonsense anti-trans rhetoric. And of course, we're back to that whole costume question again too. But even if all of that wasn't enough to convince you, the flick then goes out of its way to conflate Buffalo Bill with transgender people anyway. And it does that by doing things like this. But don't worry, they're not trans, they just think they are. Silence of the Lambs may be transphobic, but it's still good. It's a great movie with some incredible performances and an incredibly well realised feminist theme. It also doesn't apply to Phillips's two simultaneous unveilings concept. But that doesn't really matter because in the timeline of these movies, by the time we've reached the 1990s, you can't just redo Psycho like De Palma did. Silence of the Lambs is the next step in evolution for transcoded characters as killers in movies. Such as the legacy of Hitchcock's Psycho, ultimately different readings can be drawn. And the film is never all that explicitly clear about what's really going on. The psychiatrist at the end of Psycho tells us,
He was never all Norman, but he was often only mother.
but I'm not sure I really get that. Sure, there's some half-baked ideas here about some sort of misinterpreted mental illness that we now all understand based on our knowledge of tropes and the problematic ways cinema portrays mental health. But if we look at it in relation to what the film's showing us up until that point, all we've really got is the notion that on one side there's Norman, on the other side there's Mother, and they come together in the middle inside the body of a man. And that doesn't really make any sense. It's nothing. It has no basis in reality. Dressed to Kill just kind of plucks this out of Psycho and pops it into its own script as if it were an easily understandable motive for doing violent murders of women. And Silence of the Lambs is basically pretty much the same. Sure, this time being trans isn't just a simple motive like revenge or whatever, but it still equates the transness with the motive. That's a point though. You know the revenge genre is a thing? Well, that's a whole problematic subgenre as well. But they've got their own name. The Revenge-O-matic. If we're going to have a subgenre built around the structure and then reveal of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, and that subgenre is going to keep spewing out problematic trans representation, then we can at least have an equally cool sounding name. But the best I could come up with was Transomatics, and that just sounds like some sort of weird Transformers thing, so ideas in the comments, I guess. That's a YouTube thing, isn't it? Maniacal, villainous and murderous, despite the film's best efforts to explain and separate the two, trans people don't come off looking all that good on the basis of Hitchcock's masterpiece. And for evidence of this, all we have to do is look at all the films that followed in its wake. Far from learning or growing or progressing with the times, by and large these movies, these Transomatics, more often than not only act to throw fuel on this particular fire. And there's little point in arguing that they haven't had an impact on the way that the general public view trans people because, well, they have.
Most people don't want men in their spaces. They don't want men in spaces with their daughters. And so it's unlikely I'm just going to meet some random person on the street that doesn't agree with me. But, you know, that's not the case when I'm all over the news on a daily basis, trending on a daily basis as kind of more poisonous than a funnel web spider.
So what is the impact? Well, for me, a lot. Psycho is arguably one of the key movies in my early movie watching experience. Along with Nicholas Roeg's The Witches and the Hammer horror films, it was definitely a gateway into the horror genre. Roeg's movie absolutely terrified me, by the way. It's icky and creepy and gross on a level akin to something David Cronenberg would throw out, and I didn't sleep for weeks after watching it. Fucking Roeg. But one has to wonder whether Psycho's trouble in trans reading had an impact on me growing up. I knew that there was something going on with me fairly early on, but I didn't have the support network or the language to begin to understand it. I also knew that I responded in an unusual way to Hitchcock's flick. I didn't relate to Norman, that would be terrifying, but there was something about the way the movie portrayed his motive that just didn't sit right with me. And I suspect that's partly what drew me to it. I picked it apart, not just from a filmmaking perspective, but from a film analysis perspective too. Psycho introduced me to the idea that films could be about more than their narratives would have you believe, and it also led me to a bunch of other movies, including the Transomatics. By the time I'd reached the likes of Dressed to Kill and then Silence of the Lambs, something had become very clear. The movies were saying that there was something wrong with me, and without the language or the support network to really explore that, they were my only means of education. And that fucking sucks. We bring ourselves to the table when we consume media. This won't be the case for everyone, this is a purely subjective and personal opinion. But I do think it helps to illustrate why this kind of thing can be so harmful and so impactful. I didn't necessarily realise it at the time, but Psycho was helping shape my understanding of transgender people. And that's an understanding that I had to recontextualise and reevaluate as I got older and began to explore who I am. Of course, it doesn't help matters that the general public also use these films to build their understanding. These movies work in conversation with each other, but they also work in conversation with the audience and with the world around them. Transomatics are all well and good when they exist within a vacuum of a specific filmography or output, but when we start to contextualise these things within wider society, we see a problem. Take J.K. Rowling's now infamous Troubled Blood. The book features a now imprisoned and notorious serial killer who once tricked some of his female victims into his van by wearing a wig and a woman's coat to appear unthreatening. Rowling and her defenders claim that this is all just part of the long history of Transomatics, except Rowling isn't Hitchcock, and she isn't preying on a generalised social fear that exists beyond the artist and their work. Instead, Rowling's book was released within a fire that she herself helped fan the flames of. Rowling doesn't choose to tackle the trope in an interesting way, or even comment on it within a society that supposedly has a better understanding of these issues. She chooses instead to lazily uphold a stereotype that Hitchcock did with more intrigue and thought when he invented it in 1960. Because even when she's being bigoted, she can't be original. In effect, what Rowling did with Troubled Blood was legitimise the transomatic within anti-trans circles, twisting it from a troubling but generalised social fear of the other to a weaponised method of attack. If I pour petrol into an empty bucket, who cares? But if I pour it onto a burning building, I've made the fire worse. And there's a part of me can't help but wonder if all of this is because Marion Crane decided to take a goddamn shower. Smarter people than me have pointed this out, but it is interesting to note that the two most iconic elements of Psycho are the shower sequence, which takes place in a bathroom, and the fact that Norman actually is Mother all along. While out here in the real world, the toilet has become an unexpected focal point for dissensus in contemporary feminism in the UK, spotlighting divisions over trans bodies, identities and freedoms. Of course, I'm not claiming that Psycho is entirely responsible for the fearsome gender-critical feminists claim to have over who can go pee-pee in a public toilet. That would be ridiculous. Of course, we can't have this conversation without noting that particular coincidence. After all, by depicting such horrific, random and ultimately pointless violence within the would-be safety of the bathroom, Hitchcock's film imagined the size of horror in the quotidian world of the viewer, showing that horrifying violence was an integral part of middle-class America, repressed beneath its seemingly placid exterior. Part of what makes the shower scene so impactful is that it takes place in a bathroom. Bathrooms are where we as human beings are at our most vulnerable. Send help! We all get this though, right? I mean, media uses this constantly in many different ways, including often to comedic effect.
This little baby's gonna stay right here.
Oh, Ryan Gosling, I love you even on a toilet. But so ingrained is our fear and vulnerability surrounding bathrooms that it has appeared as a key component of hate movements across almost all of history.
Public restrooms can often be a hangout for the homosexual. Bobby and his friends hadn't noticed the man who had been in the restroom when they changed, and as it was late, he suggested they take the shortcut under the pier. but the others preferred to take the more traveled way home.
It's interesting as well, I think, that the link between queerness, mental health and bathrooms exists well beyond Psycho. While I don't think Hitchcock was being purposefully bigoted, no doubt he knew this and played upon the psychology of his audience to create the tension and shock of the scene. Bathrooms have become like a shorthand for filmmakers to place their characters in vulnerable positions. 2009's comedy horror Zombieland recognises this, turning the concept of bathrooms as spaces of vulnerability into a joke with its rules to survive in the apocalypse. Rule number 3 is beware of bathrooms. Meanwhile, the bathroom has long been used post-Psycho as a space for danger and violence, precisely because it is a private space where we are arguably at our most vulnerable. 1990's Arachnophobia has a scene in the shower, 2000's What Lies Beneath features it heavily throughout the movie, and Wes Craven's 1997 sequel Scream 2 uses it in its opening scene. Moreover, there's this sense in Psycho that Mother is killed to cleanse. The image of Marion Crane innocently cleaning herself, having made the decision to return the money and do the right thing, can't help but be associated with a sort of washing off of the sin. As Robin Wood writes, Marion moves toward the shower in order to feel the purifying water flow coolly down her face and body, frees herself from her anguish, and washes herself with the naturalness of a bird. All the way through the essay, Wood talks about birds and stuff. It's really weird and I don't get it. That she's attacked so brutally and so suddenly in that moment only furthers the idea that the killer's presence in the bathroom is an invasion. Marion, at her most vulnerable and innocent, is hacked to pieces by a shadowy figure who should not be there to witness her in such an intimate and private moment. As Glenn Donner puts it, although the bathroom remains a place of sexual vulnerability, violent death is thus perversely concomitant with cleanliness and privacy. It's the invasion of this otherwise would-be safe space that really heightens the cruelty and violence of Marion's demise. The way the film plays upon this deeply instilled psychological aspect of the audience has, surely, been caused to in many ways conflate the issues of transness and of gender-specific spaces. And of course we have to acknowledge that there's a less deeper reading of the shower scene. It's a fantastic twist, easily one of the most exceptional blendings of editing, visuals and music ever committed to screen, but it's also a nasty and violent sequence that sees a beautiful woman brutally slashed to pieces by a man who identifies as a woman. Like Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, Bates is mutilating and destroying the very body he wishes to possess. And while his motives may be less outwardly grotesque than Bill's, the outcome is much the same. Trans people are a danger to cis people and heteronormativity. Not because of any well-established motive or anything, but simply because they are trans. Of course, Psycho as a text is far more concerned with Norman's sexual repression than it is his transness. Indeed, it's almost beyond opinion to say that the idea of gender dysphoria never even crossed the filmmaker's mind. The film focuses far more on Norman's sexual repression than it does any idea that he may personally identify as a woman. And he doesn't, but the film confuses itself. Norman and Mother are not, despite what Dr. Exposition tells us, one and the same. The fact is, the film doesn't even attempt to explore Norman's gender as gender. Instead, it presents the two different sides of his personality as entirely different entities altogether. There's Norman, and then there's Mother, and this feeds into ideas around transgender people that are just wrong. When Norman discovers Marion's body after the infamous shower sequence, he's genuinely unaware of what's happened and horrified by Mother's actions. That both Norman and Mother can exist in the same scene, hold conversations with one another, and act independently of one another is important. It's one of the key reasons why Norman Bates isn't actually trans, and that's why this constant conflation of these complex and often difficult to understand issues is troublesome. Norman's mental health problems are the result of an inability to deal with an abusive and overbearing mother, a struggle with loss, grief and trauma, and his own deep-seated sexual repression. These are his true motives, and his supposed transness doesn't even really enter into it. But because of the way the film is constantly conflating the two within the minds of the audience, because the imagery is inconsistent with the dialogue, and because the way audiences generally receive things, they just wind up becoming one and the same. Norman leers at Marion undressing, spying on her through the peephole in the wall, and then Mother kills her because of his arousal. Thus, all trans people are sexual deviants. I know I am. His repressed sexual desires are the biggest cause of the murders, and the film constantly illustrates and alludes to this point. Norman spying on Marion through the peephole is just one such example. Elsewhere, the film employs the constant use of symbols and iconography recognisable as tropes of Victorian melodrama: a haunted house, a sinister figure locked away upstairs, dark shadowy corridors and cellars. To quote Robin Wood once again, these symbols were in wide circulation at a time when the subconscious suffered the repercussions of severe sexual repression. Norman's mental state is something that gets explored in more depth and with more care in the underseen 1983 sequel Psycho 2. Directed by Richard Franklin, who at the time had a reputation himself for being Hitchcockian, and based on a screenplay by soon-to-be horror icon Tom Holland, not to be confused with Spider-Man, we're talking about the guy that wrote Chucky.
I don't believe it. I just don't believe it.
Yay, Chucky! Is my L backwards? Fuck! Psycho 2 sees a now supposedly reformed Norman Bates, played by a returning Anthony Perkins, head home to the Bates Motel and attempt to readjust to life outside the psychiatric hospital that he has spent his time since the events of the original. But since this is a horror film, soon people start showing up dead, and Norman begins to worry that Mother is making a comeback. Incidentally, if you've not seen Psycho 2, either because it just passed you by or because like me you basically considered it sacrilege, do yourself a favour and check it out. It's awesome. It's a brilliantly crafted little movie that builds on Psycho. As a film, it stands on its own, but works in conversation with Hitchcock's masterpiece, rounding out a story that you didn't even know needed a second part. And the third one ain't too bad either. But while Psycho 2 as a film builds on the original's ideas, it does a lot more to distance itself from Norman and his supposed transness than the original ever could. The threat and inner turmoil explored throughout Psycho 2 focuses almost entirely on the idea that Norman and Mother are two separate entities inhabiting one single body. As I already said, the 1960 film does try to do this, but ultimately it fails. And while Psycho 2 is hardly a shining beacon of trans representation, the film does explore this particular facet of Norman with a little more clarity and more distance from the nightmarish gender aspects present in the original. In fact, Norman as presented in Psycho 2 spends the bulk of the film fearful of Mother and her return. And this actually just raises a whole new kind of problem. Psycho 2 makes it clear that it isn't so much that Norman is Mother, but rather that Mother is taking over Norman. In Psycho 2, the Norman-Mother relationship bears a far closer resemblance to something like a possession, with Mother acting as some kind of sinister entity entirely separate from Norman, who wishes to merely use his body in order to have corporeal form. Indeed, Norman actively makes efforts to prevent Mother from taking control, and the film is especially interesting in that Norman is our protagonist, while it is arguably the unseen and mysterious spectre of Mother that is the villain. You see, it's not the man who's the killer, it's the woman in the man. And that's pretty misogynistic. It could be argued that the film actually forgoes a lot of the problematic trans representation through this angle, with the focus entirely on this now clearly separate character intruding upon Norman's psyche. But in reality, it just confuses everything even further. We still have uncomfortable undertones, most of which ripple out from the original and through the sequels, and so ultimately the character is still coded trans. And as we established earlier, that's an issue when filmmakers continue to conflate all of these things into one big ball of other that acts as a shorthand for them to be able to go, hey look, this character's different, therefore they're bad. It's in this place that Psycho and then the films that it inspired are truly troublesome. The lack of nuance and thoughtfulness paid to these transcoded characters, whether through purposeful neglect or simple misinformed opinion, often leads to the misrepresentation and then villainisation of them. And it's a villainisation that the films then reinforce by presenting them all as psychotic murderous psychopaths. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, it is again worth pointing out that Norman Bates isn't actually trans. He just falls into this big ball of gender-bending other. And that's not strictly the movie's fault. Psycho, and indeed many of the films that followed in its wake, do very specifically make the distinction. But the sad fact is, this is how movies work and this is how audiences receive them. I mean, that's certainly how I received it. And there's little doubt in my mind that I would have come out a lot earlier and far more comfortably had I and the people around me not had films like Psycho influencing our outlooks. But that's just the way it is. Okay, so what's the point in all of this? It's very easy to tar Psycho with the transphobic brush and point to it as the first domino in a long line of horror movie shaped dominoes. And that's not strictly incorrect, but I think it misses something more pertinent, which is how audiences understand these issues and how Hollywood feeds off of them and exploits them for profit. There's a lack of understanding in how things work when we simply point to a movie like Psycho and say, hey look, the killer's trans and that trope's bad and that's a problem, because it's not. The trope itself only exists because of the way society is bound by heteronormative ideas around gender, sex, and, well, everything. The film itself arguably deserves far more shade for its troubling depictions of mental health and personality disorder than it does for any of its supposed transphobic attitudes. but because so many people take it at purely surface level, and because we don't tend to think critically about these things, it's very easy to take what's being presented in a fictional narrative that's using generalised fear of the other to prey on social anxieties, and take the fictional narrative and apply it to real life. You might not consciously realise the film said it, but it still said it, and that's the thing, right? These movies aren't ways to live your life or texts from which you should form an opinion. They're narrative entertainment, and they're trying to get bums on seats to make money. The job of a movie isn't to sell a message or get a point across or whatever, but the fact remains that they're going to do that regardless of whether they mean to or not. In a sense, the audience does the work for the filmmakers. The whole point of Psycho was for Hitchcock to break out of what he perceived to be the cage of his own success. To shock and surprise and terrify audiences, and to remind everyone that he could still do those things. And he chose to do that by appealing to the broadest possible audience, in a way that utilised imagery that people of the time simply weren't used to seeing and would find shocking. Hitchcock didn't care about Psycho's transphobic legacy, he just wanted to uphold his position as a provocateur, and escape the typical Hitch reputation that had built up around him. As we become more conscious of the issues this approach can trigger, of the way this disregard for the reception of the movie can have in these terms, do filmmakers and studios have a responsibility to consider that in the work they produce? Or is the onus on the audience to understand that what they're watching isn't reality, or even necessarily a truthful reflection of it? Or is it both? Like Norman and Mother, filmmaker and audience working in tandem with one another, in conversation in an ever-changing and evolving world. The legacy of Psycho is Psycho, but also Psycho is not its legacy. There's the film, and then there's a wider social response to that film. And it can be easy to conflate the two, and I think that works well as a metaphor for how we respond to and react to everything. When Psycho tells you Norman Bates isn't trans, do you believe it? Or do you just see a man in a dress? And if so, why? What else are you bringing to the table here? What other factors from your life, your opinion, your views, your reality are you bringing with you when you're receiving what's being said? When a person tells you what gender they identify as, do you believe them? And whatever the answer to that question, why is that the answer? Just like with the movies, what outside factors are you bringing to the conversation that shape the way that you think? And in turn, why have you received and perceived those things in the way that you have? For all its groundbreaking innovation and problematic legacy, what Psycho really is a Hitchcock movie, and that means, above all, it's a work of escapist entertainment. A twisting turning narrative, one designed solely to instill fear, shock and awe into its audience. It's a roller coaster, not a literary thought exercise, and indeed even Hitch himself thought that. As David Lloyd and R. Barton Palmer put it in the introduction to their book, Hitchcock never conceived of himself as a literary adapter, nor did he want his public to perceive him as one. But we're all going to do it anyway. Hell, I just spent however long analysing Psycho like it's some kind of sacred text. Why do I love Psycho? I don't know, because it's a smart, twisty, schlocky, moody piece of Hitchcockian entertainment. And really, we should try and focus our attention on celebrating a movie that blew traditional filmmaking to smithereens, and set a standard by which all studio pictures and mainstream releases continue to be held today. But also to the way we ourselves think about and analyse the things that we use to shape and inform our opinions. I mean, this is why we should teach media studies in schools, but that's a conversation for another time. Psycho, despite its flaws, remains a masterpiece of suspense. A fantastic example of a pioneering and influential filmmaker at the top of his game. It's a smart, engaging, atmospheric, enjoyable piece of schlocky entertainment, as well as a fascinating example of a masterful director who has total control of his craft. At least, that's how I view it. The more important thing is, what do you think and why?